He walked into that coffee shop like he owned the zip code. Pressed collar, fresh haircut, that same smug little grin I used to mistake for confidence. He had a whole speech ready. I could tell by the way he sat up straight when he saw me. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have possibly known, was that I'd already won. He just hadn't gotten the memo yet. If you're watching this video, tell me where you're from or what time it is for you. The divorce papers were spread across the coffee table like a card game nobody wanted to finish. I remember the exact smell of that apartment. Stale takeout from 2 nights before, and the faint chemical sweetness of the plug-in air freshener Malcolm had picked out because he said my preference for candles was a fire hazard. Everything in that apartment had been his choice, his preference, his standard. And now here I was, sitting in the middle of it all alone, listening to his mother tell me why that was the correct outcome. Vivienne Whitfield-Park had a voice like a marble countertop, cold, smooth, and designed to make you feel like you were leaving fingerprints just by existing near it. "Stella," she said. No greeting, no hello, just my name, the way you'd say the name of a stain you were about to spray with cleaner. "I think it's best we speak plainly." I didn't say anything. I was sitting on the edge of the couch with one knee pulled up to my chest, the phone pressed against my ear so hard I could feel my pulse in my jaw. "Malcolm deserves someone who can actually grow with him," she continued. "Someone whose ambitions align with his trajectory. You've always been, and I say this with no malice, a limitation. A limitation." I turned that word over in my mind while she kept talking, the way you'd turn over a rock to see what's living underneath it. "We were never unkind to you," she said. "We accepted you into this family despite despite certain things. But frankly, Stella, a social worker's salary and a background like yours, it puts Malcolm in a position he shouldn't have to be in, explaining things, making excuses." "Excuses for what?" I said. My voice came out quieter than I expected, not weak, just steady. She paused. I think she was surprised I'd said anything at all. "For his choices," she said finally, "for the gap between what he could have had and what he settled for." I could feel something move through my chest right then. Not the thing you'd expect. Not hurt, not rage. More like a lock clicking open, like some part of me had been waiting for someone to just say it out loud so I could finally stop pretending it wasn't true. "I appreciate your honesty," I told her. Another pause. "Well," she said, and there was something almost flustered in it. She'd expected tears, maybe. A fight. Not that. "I do," I said. "It's helpful to know exactly where I stand." She cleared her throat, said something about wishing me well in a tone that wished me nothing of the sort, and then she was gone. I sat there for a long time after that, the phone in my lap, looking at the papers on the table. The lamp in the corner was the ugly brass one Malcolm had inherited from his grandmother, the one I'd always hated and never said so. I thought about what Vivienne had said, a limitation. And then I thought about the night 3 weeks before when I'd stood in the hallway outside the second bedroom, the one Malcolm used as a home office, and heard him on the phone, his voice low and almost gentle with embarrassment, saying, "She's a good person, Garrett, just not what I pictured for myself long term. It's like I never fully committed to the vision, you know? Not what he pictured for himself long term." I stood up. I picked up the pen that was sitting on top of the papers, and I signed every page that needed my signature, slow and neat, one after another, the way my mother had taught me to write, like what you put on paper matters. Then I set the pen down, and I said, to no one in particular, to that ugly brass lamp and those beige walls and that whole apartment that had never once felt like mine, "Okay, now we'll see." I didn't know what that meant yet, but I meant it. 7 years before that phone call, I was standing in a gymnasium that smelled like the inside of a Goodwill bin. Donated clothes and rubber and something faintly sweet and dusty that I could never quite name. I was 19. I had $17 in my checking account, a statistics exam in 2 days that I was not prepared for, and a volunteer shift I'd committed to because helping at the campus donation drive was the only thing that week that felt like it actually mattered. I was assigned to the clothing sort table on the east wall. It was exactly what it sounds like. A long, folding table covered in garbage bags, full of donated clothes that needed to be sorted, checked for tears or stains, folded and tagged by size. I liked this job. There was something satisfying about it, taking a thing that felt like chaos and making it organized, making it usable for someone who needed it. I was maybe 20 minutes in, folding a men's flannel shirt that was perfectly fine except for a missing button on the left sleeve, when someone came and stood at the other end of my table. I glanced up. He was tall, wearing a gray Henley that fit the way clothes fit on people who don't have to think about whether they can afford clothes. He had his hands in his pockets, and he was looking at the garbage bags the way you'd look at a problem on a standardized test. Like he understood there was a correct answer, but had no earthly idea what it was. "Are we supposed to just dig in?" he said. He had the slight upward inflection of someone used to asking questions to people who will answer them helpfully. "You just dig in," I said. He pulled the nearest bag toward him and looked inside. He reached in and pulled out a sweater. It was olive green with small brown buttons, and someone had clearly loved it once because it was soft and worn in a good way. He held it up and examined it. "Is there a technique?" he said. "Like a correct way to fold donated clothes? Or is it just approximate?" "Wing it," I said. "The family that gets it isn't going to care if the creases are perfect. They just need the sweater." He looked at me then. He had brown eyes and the kind of easy, uncomplicated face that people with comfortable lives sometimes have. Not because they're shallow, but because worry hasn't set up permanent residence there yet. And he grinned. It was a good grin, a little self-deprecating. Like he knew he was out of his element and found that genuinely funny rather than threatening. "Wing it," he repeated. "Okay, I can wing it." His name was Malcolm Whitfield-Park. Finance major, junior year, fulfilling the fraternity's community service requirement. He told me this without any of the embarrassment it probably deserved, which I actually respected. He wasn't pretending to be there for noble reasons. He said he'd signed up because his roommate told him the gymnasium shift was supposed to be easy and he had a paper due the next morning. But honestly, the paper was not going well. I told him the paper not going well was his problem, and the sweaters were his responsibility for the next 2 hours. He laughed, and we sorted clothes and talked. I'm not going to pretend the conversation was ordinary because it wasn't. He asked about my social work major like he actually wanted to understand it, not with the polite, slightly glazed tolerance I usually got when I explained that I wanted to work with foster kids and domestic violence survivors. He asked follow-up questions. He asked what the hardest part was. He asked how I'd gotten interested in it. I told him about my cousin Deja, who'd gone into the foster system at 8 years old and had 4 placements in 3 years, and how I'd watched my aunt navigate a system that seemed designed to exhaust people into giving up. He listened. He told me about his finance major with this dry little self-awareness that I found disarming. He said he was preparing, in his words, for a lifetime of moving numbers around on screens in ways that would primarily benefit people who already had plenty. He said it like it bothered him a little. At the time, I believed it did. He came from money. I understood that immediately, and he didn't try to obscure it. He mentioned a lake house his family had in Michigan. He mentioned ski trips. He said it all matter-of-factly, the way you mention things that are just part of the landscape of your life. Not trying to impress me, not trying to hide it either. I came from Harwick, a small town in central Ohio that nobody outside of central Ohio has heard of, where my dad had worked construction until a fall off a scaffolding when I was 12 left him with chronic back pain and a reduced capacity for the work. My mom cleaned houses. She was still cleaning houses. She would clean houses until her hands made it impossible, which was starting to happen. I was at college on a patchwork of federal aid and 2 scholarships and 3 part-time jobs. The campus library on weekdays, waitressing at a diner on weekends, tutoring freshman composition whenever I could fit it in. I was tired in a way that had become so constant I'd stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing the noise of a highway when you live near one. Malcolm listened to all of this. He didn't flinch, didn't perform sympathy, didn't say anything that felt condescending. He said my work ethic was genuinely impressive. Looking back, I know now that impressive can be another word for exotic. I know that what he was actually doing, though I don't think he was doing it on purpose, was romanticizing my circumstances, filing my poverty under authentic and grounded and real in a way that made it an interesting feature rather than a grinding daily reality. But sitting there in that gymnasium that smelled like old sweaters and donated hope, I just thought I'd met someone who actually wanted to know me. We stayed 20 minutes past the end of the shift, finishing the bags on our table, because neither of us wanted to stop talking. When we finally walked out into the cold November air, he asked if I wanted to get coffee sometime. I said sure. That was the beginning of everything. The next 2 years felt easy, in a way that nothing in my life had felt before or has felt since, and I want to be clear about that. It wasn't naive or blind on my part. The ease was real. It was just also, as it turned out, temporary. We studied together in the library on Sunday afternoons, him spread out at the wide table on the 3rd floor with his finance textbooks and his color-coded notes, me across from him with case study printouts and my highlighted copy of whatever social policy text I was working through that week. He was good at numbers in a way that was almost annoying. He could look at a statistics problem I'd been fighting for 30 minutes and just sort of see the answer. I was better at writing, at making an argument on the page, and he'd slide his papers across the table without asking, and I'd read them and mark them up, and he'd actually use the edits rather than just nodding and ignoring them. We got food from the campus vendors, $3 burritos from the cart by the science building, or the flat falafel wraps from the place in the student union that was only good on Tuesdays for reasons nobody could explain. We'd eat on the quad when the weather allowed, sitting on the concrete steps by the fountain that only worked in April and May. We talked about everything, what we wanted, what we were afraid of, what we thought the world should look like, and what we thought it actually was. He never made me feel poor during those years. That is the truth, and I want to state it plainly because I've spent time since trying to determine if I missed signs or ignored them, and honestly, I did not miss them in college. He was genuinely thoughtful about money in those years. When I said I couldn't afford to do something, he didn't push it or insist on paying in ways that would have felt humiliating. He'd just say, "What about this instead?" and suggest something free. We hiked state park trails on Saturday mornings. We went to every free campus concert, regardless of the genre. I saw Malcolm endure an experimental jazz performance he visibly did not understand with such good-natured patience that I laughed about it for a week. We spent Sunday afternoons just walking around whatever part of the city we hadn't walked through yet, looking at things, talking. I thought that was who he was. I genuinely did. I thought the version of Malcolm who didn't care about expensive restaurants and didn't need designer labels and found the lake house and the ski trips slightly embarrassing to mention. I thought that was the real him. I thought the country club family was just his origin story, and that he, like me, was becoming someone different. Love does something to your reasoning. It doesn't make you stupid. It just makes you weight certain evidence more heavily than other evidence. I was weighing the Malcolm who ate $3 burritos and read my edits and held my hand on cold walks. I was not weighing the Malcolm who had never once had to worry about whether he could afford textbooks. The truth, which I only understood later, is that it's easy to not care about money when you have it. It's easy to live simply when simplicity is a choice, rather than a constraint. He wasn't doing anything dishonest exactly. He was just being 20 years old in a context where money had never been a problem, and so he genuinely didn't think about it the way I did. The gap between us wasn't visible to him the way it was to me because he'd never had to see it, but I didn't understand any of that yet. In those 2 years, I was just happy, genuinely uncomplicated happy, which is worth naming even now. It was real, even if it didn't last. Graduation happened in May, in an outdoor ceremony on the main lawn that smelled like cut grass and sunscreen and somebody's mother's perfume. I wore a gown that was half an inch too short because I'd been assigned the wrong size and had no time to exchange it. Malcolm's parents were there. I met them properly for the first time that day, in the middle of a crowd in a context that gave nobody time to really talk. His father, Douglas, pumped my hand once with the efficient warmth of a man who shook a lot of hands professionally. His mother, Vivienne, kissed the air near my cheek and said, "Malcolm speaks so highly of you," in a tone that communicated she had not yet verified this claim independently. My mom and dad came from Harwick. My dad's back had been bad that week, and he'd taken a long time getting out of the car. He wore the blue blazer he'd bought for my cousin Deja's wedding 3 years before, and it was slightly too big in the shoulders now. My mom had her good earrings on, small gold hoops she'd had since before I was born. They stood in the crowd looking proud and slightly overwhelmed by the size of everything, and I hugged them both as long as I could before the ceremony started. After graduation, the paths diverged fast. I started at the Cuyahoga County Department of Children and Family Services, which is exactly as underfunded and exhausting as it sounds. My caseload in the first 6 months was technically within guidelines and practically impossible. Foster children who'd been moved too many times, families teetering on the edge of crisis, paperwork that ate hours I didn't have. I came home most evenings wrung out in a way that went bone deep. But I also came home knowing the names of the kids on my caseload, knowing their situations, knowing that what I was doing mattered, even when the system made it nearly impossible to do it well. The salary was $38,000 a year. I shared a 2-bedroom apartment with a coworker named Priya so I could afford groceries. Malcolm joined his father's investment firm, Whitfield-Park Capital, in a junior analyst role that came with a starting salary. I didn't know the exact number of, but which was, based on context clues like the fact that he leased a car and started talking about building his portfolio, somewhere in the vicinity of 4 times mine. We were still together. We were in love. But the gap between us, which had been invisible or at least ignorable in the flat terrain of college life, became impossible to miss once we were out in the world and the terrain had hills. He moved into an apartment in the short north that had exposed brick and a rooftop deck. I stayed in the 2-bedroom with Priya because I couldn't afford otherwise. He started wearing clothes that fit differently, not flashier exactly, but more deliberate. He began having opinions about restaurants, not snobbishness, just preference. The preference of someone who could afford to have preferences. His parents' opinions came more frequently. Vivienne started calling more often, and I could hear in the edges of Malcolm's conversations with her that she was asking about plans, about timelines, about what exactly the long-term picture looked like. When he proposed, it was genuine and sweet, and I said yes without hesitation, because I loved him and I believed in us. The proposal happened on a hiking trail, not at a fancy restaurant, and I thought that meant something. I thought it meant we were still the people we'd been in college, that the trail version of us was the real version. The engagement announcement dinner at his parents' country club told a different story. I wore the nicest dress I owned, navy blue, knee-length, bought 2 years before for a job interview and worn carefully since. I felt, walking into that dining room, the carpet, the chandelier, the women in clothes that cost more collectively than my annual salary. Like someone had dropped me into a play for which I had not been given a script. Vivienne asked about my parents. Her tone had that particular quality of someone who has already formed a conclusion and is simply performing the process of arriving at it for the sake of appearances. I told her my dad was in construction and my mom cleaned houses. The silence that followed lasted approximately 4 seconds. It felt longer. Douglas cleared his throat and pivoted to Malcolm's career trajectory with the practiced smoothness of a man who had redirected many uncomfortable conversations at many dinner tables. Malcolm squeezed my hand under the table. I leaned into it. I thought it was solidarity. I know now it was management. The wedding happened 11 months later, and it was beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they've been designed by people with money and taste and strong opinions about both, which is to say, it was exactly what the Whitfield-Parks wanted, and approximately nothing of what I would have chosen. The guest list was 312 people. I knew maybe 40 of them. The rest were country club members, business associates, people from Douglas's firm, people from Vivienne's various boards and committees. My family occupied 5 tables in the middle of the room, like a small island of people in rental suits and nice dresses from department stores, surrounded by a sea of designer labels and practiced social ease. The flowers were white and cream peonies, Vivienne's choice. I'd wanted something wilder, garden-style, colorful, but the florist Vivienne hired didn't really consult me so much as present me with options within a pre-approved aesthetic range. The venue was a historic estate outside the city with manicured grounds and a ballroom that could hold 500. There was a string quartet during the cocktail hour. There was a 7-course meal. There were ice sculptures on the buffet tables. 2 of them shaped like swans, which I found genuinely bizarre and which I was told were traditional for events of this type. My mom cried during the ceremony. She was sitting in the 3rd row on my side, and when I walked down the aisle, I could see her face. And she was crying with the contained, quiet dignity of someone who has taught herself to feel things without inconveniencing others with them. I thought at the time it was just the normal emotion of watching your daughter get married. It was only later, after everything, that I called her and asked, and she admitted she'd been crying partly because she'd felt so out of place the entire day, that she'd gone to the bathroom twice just to have somewhere to go, where she didn't feel like she was doing something wrong by existing. My mother cried at my wedding because she felt like she didn't belong there. And I didn't know. I was too busy being a bride, navigating a day that had been produced for an audience I didn't know, to see what was happening to my own mother. Malcolm and I danced to a song we'd chosen together, one small concession in the otherwise Vivienne-produced event. He held me close and said, "We did it," into my hair, and he sounded genuinely happy. I believed him. I still believe he was happy in that moment. I just think his happiness and mine were about different things, and we didn't know it yet. We left for a honeymoon in Italy, also the Whitfield-Parks' gift, also their choice of destination. And it was gorgeous, and I was grateful, and I spent the whole time feeling slightly like a guest in someone else's vacation. That was the beginning of the marriage, and the beginning, though I couldn't see it yet, of the slow erosion of everything I'd thought we were. It didn't happen overnight. That's the thing about this kind of damage. It comes in small doses, regular and quiet, and by the time you notice what it's doing to you, it's been doing it for years. The first year was fine, mostly. We were building a life. We found an apartment together. His choice of neighborhood, which I could not have afforded on my own and did not pretend otherwise. He paid more of the rent. That was practical, and I didn't resent it at the time. What I didn't account for was the way that financial arrangement would begin to feel, over time, like a running tab. The comments started small. When I told him I'd had a particularly hard week, a child on my caseload moved to an emergency placement, a family I'd been working with for months fell apart. He'd listen, and then he'd say something like, "I just don't know how you do it. I couldn't handle that kind of, heaviness, every day." Which sounds sympathetic. And maybe it was at first, but over time I began to hear something else underneath it. The implication that what I did was relentlessly grim and not particularly rewarding in ways that counted, in ways that showed up in a paycheck. The dinner parties were harder. Malcolm's colleagues and their partners were smart, accomplished, and almost uniformly wealthy. They talked about things I didn't have context for: market positions, investments, vacation homes, the relative merits of private schools in various suburbs they were considering. When I talked about my work, I could feel the temperature of the conversation shift. People were polite. They said things like, "That must be so rewarding." And then they changed the subject. Malcolm stopped offering me openings to speak at those dinners. Not dramatically, just a gradual withdrawal, like a tide going out so slowly you don't notice until you're standing somewhere unexpected. He started telling my work stories for me, shorter and funnier than the reality. He got good at steering conversation away from my caseload and toward whatever common ground he could find between me and whoever we were eating with. I told myself he was trying to help me fit in. It took me longer than it should have to understand he was trying to help himself not be embarrassed. The night that made it undeniable was a company dinner at a rooftop restaurant downtown, the kind of place where the menu has a QR code and the cocktails have names like something you'd hear in a riddle. I was telling a story about a policy change at work that I was genuinely excited about. A new rapid response protocol for emergency placements that was cutting processing time significantly and actually making outcomes better. I was maybe 3 sentences in when I noticed Malcolm's expression. It wasn't mean, it was just absent, like he'd stepped away from inside himself. And across the table, his colleague Barrett was looking at his phone with the phone tilted slightly so it wasn't obvious. I stopped talking. I wrapped up the story in 1 sentence and said something like, "Anyway, so that's the news from the trenches." Malcolm looked back at me then. He gave me a quick, tight smile that said, "Good, we moved on, good." And I sat there with a glass of wine that cost $18 and thought, how long has this been happening? 3 weeks later, I heard him through the office door. "She's a good person, Garrett." Just Malcolm was across the table between his father and his senior colleague, Barrett, and the conversation had drifted to something about a community development fund the firm was involved with. "There's real money in impact investing right now," Barrett was saying, "if you frame it right." "Stella actually works in social services," Malcolm said. I looked up. It was the first time he'd referenced me in a professional context in about 40 minutes, so I was paying attention. She'd know more about where the actual need is. I started to respond. I had something useful to say. I knew exactly where the gaps in community development funding were, because I saw them in my work every day. I said maybe 2 sentences. Malcolm talked over me, smoothly, not aggressively. The way you redirect a conversation when someone has said something slightly off point. He said, "What she means is," and then said something simpler and more palatable to the room, and moved on. The table moved on. I sat. Then I went to the closet and got out the box of things I'd packed carefully over the previous 2 weeks. The books that were mine, the framed photos, the small plant I'd been nurturing for 3 years that somehow hadn't died. I unpacked them slowly, put the books on the shelf, put the plant in the window, hung 1 photo on the wall. Just 1. Me and my mom taken at my college graduation, her in her good earrings. Then Vivienne called and delivered her verdict. And I signed the papers. And I said, "Okay, now we'll see." I moved into a studio apartment in Cleveland Heights that cost $720 a month, which I could afford if I was careful, which I was going to have to be. The apartment had a radiator that clicked in the night, a kitchen window that looked out onto a fire escape, and a ceiling in the bathroom with a water stain shaped roughly like the state of Florida. I liked it. It was completely mine. For the first 6 months, I kept my head down, worked my caseload, went to the grocery store on Sundays, and cooked enough food to last the week, called my mom on Tuesday evenings, read books I'd been meaning to read for years, got 8 hours of sleep for the first time in my adult life. But there was something working quietly in the back of my mind during those months. Something that had started the night I heard Malcolm say, "Not what I pictured through the office door." A question. The question was, what am I actually capable of without the weight of someone else's assessment of me pressing down on everything? I started taking on small consulting work on the side, something I could do evenings and weekends that used my expertise in a different way. Child welfare policy analysis, mostly. Nonprofits and small government agencies that needed someone who actually understood how the system worked from the inside. I spent the 2 weeks later, I got a call from their HR director. "We've decided to move in a different direction," she said. I asked, politely, professionally, if she could share any feedback about the decision. There was a pause. And then, because she was a decent person and I think she felt bad, she gave me more than she probably should have. "Between us," she said, "the position was essentially promised to someone internally before the external search opened. There was some board pressure to run a formal process, but the outcome was predetermined. I'm sorry, your presentation was one of the strongest we saw." I thanked her. I hung up. I sat at my kitchen table, the small round one from the thrift store on Coventry that I'd sanded and refinished myself. And I stayed very still for a while. I had spent close to $900 I didn't easily have on the suits, the gas, the professional materials, the coffee meetings. There were maybe 30 people in the room when I started. I was the third presenter on a 3-person panel, which meant I was going after 2 speakers who had both run significantly over their time, and I had exactly 11 minutes. I didn't adjust. I gave the presentation I'd prepared, compressed, fast, and I said what I needed to say about the gap between policy as written and policy as implemented, about the way good ideas died in the distance between the legislative office and the frontline caseworker. I said it like I believed it because I did. I looked at the 30 people in that room like they were 300. Afterward, while I was repacking my laptop bag, a woman came up to me. She was maybe 60, short with close-cropped silver hair and reading glasses pushed up on her head, and the kind of posture that says, "I have been in many rooms, and I have decided what I think about all of them." "Dr. Harriet Hargrove," she said, and she extended her hand. I knew the name. Anyone in child welfare consulting knew the name. She'd built one of the most respected independent practices in the Midwest over 25 years, had done work at the federal level, had published research that was actually cited in court cases. She was the person you read about when you were trying to understand what was possible. "Stella Bowen," I said. We shook hands. "Your 11 minutes," she said, "were more useful than the preceding 40. She was not saying it to be charming. She said it the way she'd say a factual thing. "Thank you," I said. "How long have you been doing consulting work?" I told her. I was honest about the scale. Small clients, modest rates, solid outcomes. I didn't inflate it and I didn't minimize it. She nodded. Then she said something unexpected. "I've heard your name before. From Vivienne Whitfield-Park. Are you familiar with her?" I kept my face exactly where it was. "She was my mother-in-law," I said. "Briefly. She mentioned you in a board context, maybe 2 years ago," Dr. Hargrove said. "I was advising one of the foundations she sat on. She referred to you as—" She paused, the slight pause of someone choosing words carefully, "as an unfortunate chapter in her son's life." I looked at her. "She's not wrong that it was brief," I said. Something shifted in Dr. Hargrove's expression. Not sympathy, more like recognition. "She said it the way people say things when they want you to understand someone's value is negligible," she said. I noticed that at the time. I tend to notice when people are dismissed in that particular way. "Why?" I said. "Because it was done to me," she said, consistently for about 15 years, until I stopped being dismissible. We stood in that conference room for another 20 minutes. When we left, we had a lunch meeting scheduled for the following week. Lunch was at a diner in Cleveland that Dr. Hargrove had been going to since the 90s, a narrow place with red vinyl booths and laminated menus, and the best walnut pie I've ever had. And I don't even particularly like walnut pie. She ordered coffee, black, and the club sandwich, and she ate while we talked, which I liked. People who eat normally at business lunches are generally telling you that the conversation matters more than the performance. She told me about her own trajectory, the academic path, the years of being told she was theoretically impressive, but not quite the right fit for this grant, or that position, or this leadership role. The point at which she decided that the people doing the dismissing were not the point. The work is the point, she said. The clients are the point. The rest is noise, but you have to learn to navigate the noise or it drowns you. She'd built her practice, client by client, relationship by relationship, with a particular focus on agencies and governments that needed translation. Someone who could take what the research said and turn it into something implementable by real people in under-resourced systems. That's what I heard in your presentation, she said. You understand both sides of the gap. That's not common. She offered me a partnership structure, junior partnership to start. I would bring my existing clients under the Hargrove practice umbrella, gain access to her network and her ongoing contracts, and in exchange contribute a percentage of my billing and a significant chunk of my time to the collaborative projects she was developing. It was a real offer with real terms, and she had a contract drafted by the end of the following week. Why are you doing this? I asked her on the phone when she told me the contract was ready, because I needed to understand it. People don't just do things. 3 reasons, she said. 1, I'm 61 and I'm thinking about what happens to this work when I slow down, which I intend to do in approximately 8 years. 2, you're good, and good people in this field burn out or give up if they don't have structure supporting them. And 3, she paused, because Vivienne Whitfield-Park dismissed you in a room where I was sitting, and I've spent my career specifically helping people who've been dismissed in that particular way learn that they were wrong about themselves. I didn't say anything for a moment. I'll sign the contract, I said. I know you will, she said. Read it first. I read it. I signed it. And something that had been stuck for 3 years began, quietly but undeniably, to move. 4 months into the partnership, Dr. Hargrove asked me to help her audit a grant compliance file for one of her long-standing clients, a regional family services agency that received funding from several foundations and needed a thorough review of their documentation before a renewal application. The audit was dry work. 3 days in a conference room at the agency's offices, going through binders of financial records and grant reports and board minutes, checking that money had gone where it was supposed to go and been reported correctly. I was good at this work because I was methodical, and I didn't skim. On the second day, I was going through a sub-file of foundation correspondence, historical records mostly, several years old, and I came across a set of internal transfer documents from the Whitfield-Park Family Foundation. I stopped. I knew the foundation. Malcolm's parents had chaired it for years. It was one of those old money vanity foundations that funded local arts organizations and youth programs and gave the family a reason to have their names on buildings. I'd been to 2 of their annual galas, standing by Malcolm's side, smiling at people who smiled back at me the way you smile at someone else's accessory. The documents I was looking at showed a series of fund transfers from the Foundation's charitable reserve to an entity called WPK Advisory Services. The amounts were significant. Tens of thousands moved quarterly over a period of about 2 years. The transfers were labeled as consulting fees, but there was no consulting contract in the file. No deliverable report, no external audit notation. I sat there for a long moment. WPK Whitfield-Park. I thought about Douglas. I thought about Malcolm's firm. I thought about what consulting fees with no documentation looked like in a grant compliance context. I took out my phone and photographed every page of that sub-file. 16 photographs. I was careful, clear, everything legible. Then I put the binder back, exactly as I'd found it, and I finished the rest of the audit. I didn't say anything to Dr. Hargrove that day. I needed to think. I drove home with 16 photographs on my phone and the particular feeling of someone who has accidentally found something much larger than what they were looking for. 2 days later, there was an ice storm, the kind that happens in northeast Ohio in late January and is not a dramatic snowstorm but a quiet, ugly glazing of everything with a centimeter of ice that makes the world look beautiful and feel treacherous. The power in my building went out at 7 in the evening. It was out for 11 hours, I had candles, I had enough food, I was fine. What I didn't think about until the power came back and I went to plug in my phone was that 11 hours without power, with my phone in a cold apartment, had been hard on the battery. The phone turned on. It showed the Apple logo. Then it went to a white screen. I held the power button. Nothing. I plugged it into the wall. Nothing. I tried a different cable. Nothing. I took it to the repair shop on Lee Road the next morning. The technician, a patient young man named Deshawn, who had clearly delivered this news many times, told me that the battery had failed and in failing had corrupted the storage. The data was not recoverable. He showed me what that looked like on his diagnostic screen, a bar graph with the storage sector showing completely gray. Gone. I stood at the counter and thought, the original files were at the agency. I had returned all the binders on the last day of the audit. The agency had no reason to keep those specific sub-files accessible. They were historical records, probably boxed up and moved to off-site storage. I had nothing. 16 photographs gone. My only documentation of what I'd seen. I drove home. I sat at my round thrift store table and I thought about what I actually had, which was my memory and my word, neither of which was documentation. I thought about calling a lawyer, but a lawyer would want documentation. I thought about going back to the agency and asking to see the files again, but I didn't have a reason that wouldn't raise flags. I thought about doing nothing. I considered it seriously for about 10 minutes. And then I thought about the families that foundation money was supposed to serve, the youth programs, the children's services organizations, the families that fell through systemic cracks. No, doing nothing wasn't it. I got out the legal pad, the same one from 8 months ago with what do I actually have at the top. I flipped to a new page, and I started writing down everything I could remember, every number, every date, every name on those transfer documents, every detail I could reconstruct from memory, which turned out to be more than I expected, because I was trained to hold case details in my mind with precision, and I'd been doing it for years. It wasn't documentation, but it was a thread, and a thread in the right hands could be pulled. Dr. Hargrove had introduced me at a Columbus event in November to a financial journalist named Nathaniel Osei, who wrote for a regional business publication and occasionally for national outlets when the story warranted it. He was quiet and thorough and asked very precise questions and had the specific kind of patience that journalists have when they know they're working on something real. I called him. I have something, I told him, but I have to be honest with you about what it is and what it isn't. Go ahead, he said. I have no documentation. My documentation was destroyed in a phone failure, genuinely, not strategically. What I have is a detailed account, from memory, of what I saw in a grant compliance file. Financial transfers, specific amounts, specific dates, specific entity names. I was working in an official audit capacity when I saw it, so my access was legitimate. But I can't hand you papers because I don't have papers. Silence on the line. Then, what entity names? I told him. WPK Advisory Services, the Whitfield-Park Family Foundation, the approximate amounts and the time frame. Another silence. Okay, Nathaniel said. That's a thread. That's actually a thread I can work with. There are public filings, foundations file with the IRS. There are state charitable registration records. If what you described happened, there will be inconsistencies in those filings. I can look for them without ever mentioning you. That's what I need, I said. Why are you doing this? He asked. Not suspiciously, just directly. I thought about how to answer that honestly. Because those transfers were money that was supposed to go to kids and families, I said. And because, I'll be honest, the family involved treated me badly, And finding out they were also stealing from their own charitable foundation is information I believe should exist in the world. Fair enough, Nathaniel said. I'll start pulling filings tomorrow. I hung up the phone and sat for a moment. I hadn't planned any of this. I hadn't set out to expose Malcolm's family. I'd been doing an audit. But here we were. And if there was something real in those files, if my memory was accurate, and it was, then the thread was real, and Nathaniel would find it. The rest was out of my hands. That, too, felt like a kind of relief. It took 4 months. Nathaniel was thorough and he was careful. He wasn't going to publish anything he couldn't support with multiple independent sources, and I respected that even on the days it felt slow. The first sign was a small item in a regional business newsletter. Not Nathaniel's outlet, someone else, noting that the Whitfield-Park Family Foundation had filed an amended IRS form for the prior year, which in nonprofit circles means something went sideways in the original filing and someone noticed. The amendment was public record. No one outside nonprofit finance circles would have thought twice about it. I noticed. 3 weeks later, Douglas Whitfield-Park announced he was stepping back from his role as the foundation's chairman to focus on his primary business responsibilities. The announcement was framed as voluntary. People who knew how these things worked understood it wasn't. Then Nathaniel's piece ran. It was careful. He was careful. No accusations, no criminal language. The piece was framed as a review of compliance questions at several regional foundations with overlapping governance structures, and the Whitfield-Park Foundation was one of 4 examined. But the specific details about WPK advisory services and the transfer patterns were there, attributed to public records and multiple sources with knowledge of the foundation's financial history. I read the article in my kitchen on a Thursday morning, with coffee, at the round thrift store table. I read it twice. Then I set my phone down and said, to the Florida-shaped water stain that I'd painted over months ago in the new apartment, because I'd moved by then into a place with big windows. Okay? Malcolm's firm was not directly implicated, but Douglas's name was. And in the circles that mattered to the Whitfield-Parks, circles measured by who was on which board and who got invited to which club events and whose name appeared next to what institutions, Douglas's name appearing in a compliance story was a significant damage event. Malcolm called me for the first time in 14 months. He left a voicemail. His voice sounded careful and controlled, in the specific way of someone working hard to sound casual. He said he thought it might be nice to catch up, that he'd been thinking about things, that maybe we could grab coffee. I listened to the voicemail twice. Then I texted back, "Sure." When? He picked a place in Tremont, an upscale coffee shop with exposed concrete and very good pour-overs and small tables that required you to be close to whoever you were sitting with. He was already there when I arrived, 5 minutes early, which meant he'd probably been there for 15. He had a coffee he'd barely touched, and he was sitting up straight, and he smiled when he saw me. That same smile from the gymnasium, the easy one, he thought it still worked on me. In a way, it was touching that he thought so. "You look good," he said. "I know," I said. I said it pleasantly, matter-of-factly. I sat down and ordered a cortado and a piece of the cardamom cake that I'd had here before and knew was excellent. He waited until my order was in before he started talking. He'd prepared an opening. I could tell by the way he led with something self-deprecating, saying that the last couple of years had been educational and that he'd done a lot of thinking and that he knew he hadn't always made the choices he was proudest of. "The thing about growth," he said, "is that you don't always see where you needed it until after the fact." "That's true," I said. He paused. "I wasn't as supportive as I should have been of your work, of what you were building. I think I had a narrow idea of what success was supposed to look like, and I projected that onto," another pause, "onto us." The cardamom cake arrived. I took a bite. It was exactly as good as I remembered. I hear the firm has had some turbulence, I said gently, the way you'd mentioned the weather. He looked at me quickly. Something moved behind his eyes, just briefly, and then was controlled. Some compliance discussions, he said. It's being addressed. My father is taking a step back to allow things to be resolved without the distraction of personalities. I see, I said. He wrapped up the compliance topic briskly and pivoted back to his prepared material. He said that maybe they'd moved too fast, that the timing had been wrong, that he thought with more, he used the word maturity, things might have looked different between them. He said he wasn't suggesting anything dramatic, just that it might be nice to stay in each other's lives. That maybe there was still something worth. Malcolm, I said. He stopped. I set my fork down on the plate. I looked at him, directly. No softness in it, but no anger either. Just clear. I want to tell you about what I've been doing, I said. Not because I want you to validate it. I just think it's useful for you to have accurate information. He nodded carefully. So I told him. I told him about the consulting practice, the Hargrove partnership, the policy work, the clients, the outcomes. I told him about the shelter intake process we'd redesigned and what the retention numbers looked like now. I told him about the caseworker training program running in 3 counties. I told him about the graduate students who were working with me as paid interns, learning to do work that mattered and getting paid to do it, because I believed people should be paid for their labor. I told him about what my income looked like now, not to impress him, but to be specific, because vagueness would have allowed him to construct whatever story he preferred. I told him the number. He sat very still. I built all of that, I said, in the 4 years since the divorce, without any of the resources you had access to, without a family firm, without a network that was handed to me, without anyone who thought I had obvious potential. Stella, I'm not angry, I said, and I meant it. I'm really not. I just think you came here today with a story about me that isn't accurate, and I'd rather you have the true one. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I think I underestimated you. Yes, I said. You did. So did your mother. So did you. But that's really a story about the 2 of you, not about me. I finished the last of my coffee. I left enough cash on the table for my order and a reasonable tip. I picked up my bag. I wish you well, I said. I mean that. And I did. I walked out of that coffee shop and onto the sidewalk, and the afternoon hit me. Cool, slightly overcast, the particular gray-bright light of a Cleveland October afternoon that I have always found more honest than sunshine. My car was half a block down, and I walked to it at a normal pace. Not fast, not performing calm, just walking. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment with the door closed and the keys in my hand, and I waited to feel something. The satisfaction I'd imagined, or the sadness I'd prepared for, or some version of release that you're supposed to feel when you close a chapter definitively. I sat there and I felt nothing dramatic, something quiet. The specific quiet of a decision that's been made and doesn't need to be made again. I thought about my mother. I thought about her sitting in the back row of my wedding, crying in the contained way she had, feeling like she didn't belong. I thought about what she would say when I called her tonight, and I was going to call her tonight, and told her what the last 4 years had actually looked like, laid out end to end. She knew pieces of it. She didn't know the whole shape yet. I started the car. I pulled out onto the street. The radio came on. The NPR station, mid-story, something about a city council meeting somewhere. I turned it off and drove in quiet. I thought, on the drive home, about the night I'd stood in the hallway outside the office door and heard Malcolm say, "Not what I pictured for myself long term." I thought about sitting alone with the divorce papers and the ugly brass lamp and Vivienne's marble-cold voice in my ear. I thought about the $900 I'd spent on suits for a job that was never going to be mine. I thought about the 16 photographs gone gray in a corrupted phone, and writing everything I remembered on a legal pad by candlelight during an ice storm, and I thought about Dr. Hargrove walking across a hotel conference room toward me, because something in an 11-minute presentation had been worth crossing a room for. It wasn't a clean story. It wasn't a story where I'd been clever or strategic or perfectly intentional. I'd made mistakes. I'd followed a false lead and lost time. I'd lost evidence I needed. I'd had to improvise and rely on people I'd only just met and trust that what I'd done right was enough. But here I was, 4 years later, in a car that was mine, driving toward an apartment that was mine, with a practice and a life that were mine. And behind me, sitting at a small table in a Tremont coffee shop with a barely touched pour-over, was a man who had once told his friend that I was not what he pictured for himself long-term. I almost laughed. Almost. Instead, I just drove. The apartment I lived in now was on the 3rd floor of a building in Cleveland Heights, the same neighborhood I'd moved to after the divorce, but a different apartment. Bigger, more light. Chosen because I could afford to choose it, not because it was what I could manage. There were 3 large windows on the east wall of the living room that let in morning light so thoroughly that on good days I didn't need overhead lights until noon. I had plants, 12 of them, which most people considered excessive for an apartment this size. But I found plants settling in a way that was hard to explain. Something about a living thing that requires consistent daily small attention but doesn't require explanation. I had a spider plant that had been growing in my kitchen since the studio apartment in Cleveland Heights, a peace lily that I'd bought the week I signed the partnership agreement with Dr. Hargrove as a specific act of optimism, a fiddle leaf fig that had nearly died twice and kept coming back, which I chose to find encouraging. My bookshelves covered the entire east wall, not for aesthetics, but because I actually needed the space. Fiction, policy texts, memoirs, poetry, case study collections, a whole section on child welfare history that would have looked like reference text to anyone else but which I actually read. There was a section of novels I'd been wanting to read for years and had been reading one by one in the evenings since the divorce. There was a section of books my mother had recommended. The office was the second bedroom. A real desk, a good chair, filing systems that actually made sense, a monitor large enough to have 2 documents open side by side. The walls had 2 framed things, a print I'd bought at the Art Museum gift shop and a card that Dr. Hargrove had sent when I brought in my first major solo client, a government agency contract worth more than my entire first year of social work income. The card said, "Good work, keep going," in her handwriting, which was small and precise. The practice had 12 clients now, ranging from small nonprofits to county agencies to one state-level contract that we'd won the previous spring in a competitive bid process I'd led. We had 3 graduate student interns, Felicity, who was finishing her MSW and wanted to go into consulting, Kendrick, who was interested in policy research, and Yolanda, who was already thinking about her doctorate. I paid them real hourly wages, not experience. I paid them because unpaid labor in a field that served underpaid people was a contradiction I wasn't willing to live with. The work we did was showing up in outcomes I could point to specifically. A domestic violence shelter we'd worked with over the previous year had redesigned their intake process based on our recommendations. Their survivor retention rate was up significantly, meaning women who came through the door were staying connected to services instead of disappearing. A foster care agency in Summit County had implemented a case management protocol we'd developed and was seeing longer placement stability for kids who'd previously been moved repeatedly. Caseworkers in 3 counties had gone through the training program Dr. Hargrove and I had designed together and were reporting lower burnout and better family outcomes. Real improvement. Specific people whose lives were tangibly different because of expertise that someone once called a limitation. I thought about Vivienne saying that. I sat in my office some mornings looking at the card from Dr. Hargrove, and I thought, a limitation. She actually said that, and it genuinely no longer had the power to hurt me. It had become, over the course of 4 years, a small and slightly absurd piece of my origin story. The villain's mistaken assessment, the thing that turned out to be wrong. My mother and I talked every Tuesday evening, the same as always. She'd retired from house cleaning the previous year. Her hands had finally made it impossible, the arthritis in both wrists too far along. She was living on Social Security and the small fund I contributed to each month. Not because she'd asked me to, but because I could, and it let her live without the constant calculation of whether she could afford the heating bill and the prescriptions in the same week. She called it her breathing money, having enough that breathing felt free. I dated occasionally. Nothing that had turned into anything yet, but different from dating during the marriage years when I was constantly unconsciously shrinking myself to fit inside someone else's assessment of my value. I went out with a high school history teacher named Raymond twice, who was kind and funny and ultimately not for me, but the not for me was mutual, and we parted without drama. I went out with a woman named Sadie who worked in urban planning and who I found genuinely interesting and who I was currently in the early cautious stages of seeing seriously. I volunteered at the same shelter where I'd started, the one whose intake process we'd redesigned. Not as a consultant, not for the professional connection, but on Saturday mornings sorting donations, the same work I'd done in a gymnasium at 19, the same work that had mattered then and mattered now. I liked the continuity of it. I liked having something that connected the person I'd been to the person I was. I still thought about Malcolm occasionally, not often. When I did, it was the way you think about a difficult section of a road you've driven. You remember it was hard, you're glad it's behind you, you don't particularly need to go back. I thought about him a little differently now after the coffee shop. He'd looked, sitting across that small table with his careful posture and his prepared speech, like someone whose story wasn't going the way he'd planned it. I didn't feel triumphant about that. I felt sad, a little. Sad in a general way, the way you feel sad when you see that a thing didn't work out. Not sad in a way that had anything to do with me. The life he'd thought I wasn't capable of imagining was right here, in these windows, these plants, this work, this careful and meaningful and mind-shaped life. I hadn't built it to prove anything to him. I'd built it because I needed to know what I was actually capable of, without someone else's assessment pressing down on every choice, and it turned out I was capable of quite a lot. 3 months after the coffee shop, the Whitfield-Park Family Foundation quietly reached a civil settlement with the state attorney general's office. The terms were not fully public, but the summary that appeared in a regional nonprofit newsletter indicated that the foundation had agreed to restructure its governance, hire an independent audit firm for a period of 5 years, and make restitution of a specified amount to the charitable purposes from which the improperly transferred funds had been diverted. Douglas Whitfield-Park's name did not appear on the new governance structure. Nathaniel Osei sent me a text when the settlement was announced. It said simply, "Thread confirmed." I texted back, "Good work." He replied, "Yours too." Malcolm's firm survived, as firms tend to when only the periphery is implicated. He was not personally named in any of the compliance findings, but the names that were named were close enough to his that I imagined certain conversations had become uncomfortable in certain rooms. I did not dwell on this. It simply existed as information, and I filed it away. Vivienne Whitfield-Park did not call me. I did not expect her to. Dr. Hargrove and I were 3 weeks into developing a proposal for a state-level initiative that, if it was funded, and we believed it would be, would represent the largest contract the Hargrove practice had ever taken on. It was a child welfare systems audit and redesign project covering 6 counties, the kind of project that, if done well, would affect the lives of hundreds of children and families in ways that would outlast any single year's caseload. On a Wednesday morning in January, my office phone rang while I was reviewing the proposal draft. The number was a Columbus area code I didn't recognize. I answered. A young woman's voice, maybe 23, 24, the specific energy of someone who has rehearsed what they're about to say, but is still slightly terrified. Ms. Bowen. My name is Courtney Reeves. I'm finishing my MSW at Ohio State, and I've been following the work you and Dr. Hargrove have been doing, and I would really love to talk to you about the possibility of an internship, if you have any capacity. I know it's a long shot. I looked out my east-facing windows. The morning light was coming in strong. January light, which in Northeast Ohio is not always abundant, and so when you get it, it's worth noticing. It's not a long shot, I said. Tell me about your thesis. There was a brief, startled pause. And then she started talking. Fast and passionate and slightly run on, the way young people talk when they've been waiting for someone to ask. About her research on sibling placement in foster care, about the gaps she was finding, about what she wanted to do about them. I listened. I took notes. I asked real questions. I thought about Dr. Hargrove walking across a hotel conference room toward me because something in an 11-minute presentation had been worth the walk. I thought about what it meant to be the person who walks across the room. When Courtney finished, there was a pause, waiting. Can you come to Cleveland for a meeting? I said. Next week, if your schedule allows. Yes, she said, immediately. Absolutely yes. Good, I said. Bring your thesis outline and a list of questions, not questions you think I want to hear, questions you actually have. Okay, she said. Thank you, really. Don't thank me yet, I said. Come to the meeting first. I hung up the phone. Outside the windows, the city was doing what it did, moving, ongoing, indifferent to individual stories, and yet made entirely of them. Somewhere in the middle of it, the Whitfield-Park Family Foundation was restructuring under court supervision. Somewhere in it, Malcolm was sitting in an office at a firm navigating the consequences of choices he'd made, or inherited, or failed to question. Somewhere in it, my mother was having her Tuesday morning coffee in a kitchen where she didn't have to calculate whether she could afford the heating bill. And here, in this office with the morning light and the plants and the bookshelves and the card from Dr. Hargrove that said, "Good work, keep going," here was the life that had been called a limitation, the career that had been called depressing, the ambition that had been described as not really ambition at all. I picked up the proposal draft. I kept working. To freedom, I thought, quietly. And I meant it. If this story resonated with you, leave a like and consider subscribing. You can also drop any comment below, even just one word. Maybe tell me where you're watching from, or what time it is right now. Sometimes one word is enough to say you were here.